So, so friends, good evening to all in India, and good afternoon to Peter from South Africa. Today we are going to have a talk on a interesting, relevant, and crucial topic on behalf of Higher Education Forum and also on behalf of the SIS School of Learning. I extend a very hearty welcome to all of you who gathered over here. And the topic is relevant because NEP 2020 is talking about internationalization of the Indian education system in a big way. And therefore, we as the people related to and associated with the higher education, we must know what's happening all around us. How should we gear up the challenges? And there cannot be a better person than Professor Peter Cunningham to talk on this particular subject. We know each other for more than a decade. Peter has been a regular visitor to India. He has been coming to India prior to COVID. After COVID, there's a disruption everywhere. And so is the disruption of Professor Peter. He is an accomplished teacher in the area of the human resources, organizational behavior, change management, and all other related issues. He is a professor emeritus of the Nelson Mandela University. And we are grateful to Professor Peter that he has been kind to be with us today on this particular session for an hour or so. So on behalf of all of you, I express my gratitude to Professor Peter and request him to please take it over. Professor Peter, the floor is open.
Thank you very much. Thank you, participants who are currently engaging with me. I really thank you to allow me to actually take you through this journey of some of the external environmental conditions that are shaping your academic enterprise and shaping you to a large extent. Hopefully I shall make you reflect on yourself and stimulate your thoughts to ask questions. I think one of the irrefutable facts today is that since COVID, academia has started to change rapidly, and this pace of change is likely to accelerate in the short term. A stable and predictable academic environment is no longer, with the pace rather speeding up and always being constant. I'm very pleased that you actually spoke about internationalization in your opening remarks, because what we find increasingly is that countries need to actually looking at what, and institutions more specifically, what is their policy towards internationalization. My experience in India is that there's been very little interest in opening up that debate. So I'm very pleased that it is now firmly on the table for discussions. We're looking at things like joint degrees, mobility of students and academics, etc. However, for today's discussion, I've selected a number of topics that are guided by, firstly, your lecturing experience and what is actually influencing that experience, and possibly more importantly, what are some of the considerations that you need to keep in mind when you start doing research and when you start submitting research findings for publication. Now, just a brief outline of some of the issues which I will look at. I will take us through a very brief global scan, and then look more specifically in three areas. One, what is truth, which has become very important with the increasing massification of data and information. Two, what are the ideological frames of reference or viewpoints that are actually shaping education? And I think those are very important, as we'll discuss, why you need to bear those in mind when you're actually looking at publication. And thirdly, I'll look at the whole issue of cultural wars, which is very prevalent at the moment in academia and is to a large extent influencing how we actually interpret data, who we actually submit our publications or research articles to, etc. Then briefly, I'll look at some other considerations. Now, in terms of a really broad sweep of global events, I think we can say that 2024 has started off as a very volatile year with numerous geopolitical conflicts, China's economic uncertainties, disruption in supply chains, community unrest, roller coaster markets, monetary policy fluctuations, escalation in trade tensions, um, and possibly an area that is now being placed very much in the spotlight, an increasing number of involuntary migrant flows. And possibly lastly, I don't know to what extent you were affected by it, but the disruption of the undersea internet cables that traverse the Red Sea. Not, when you look at these points, and they're certainly not exhaustive, we can see that India, to a large extent, has been able to sidestep most of these challenges by retaining the title of being the world's fastest growing economy, 8.4% in the last 3 months of 2023. And that is now predicted to overtake Japan and Germany as the third biggest economy. Having said that, we also find that many of these issues are regional. So I will attempt in my discussion to remain as far as possible global. Because if I look at the direction that India's academia is going, it is really to find its niche in the global academic enterprise. Now, how has that been influenced? Again, looking global, and we start projecting forward. I think that one of the things that if you want to actually look at, particularly in the short and medium term, what to be researching and what are you more likely to actually get grants for, and what institutions are likely to collaborate with you in the conducting of research. A good starting point is the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, where it looks at risks in 2024 to 2026, as well as some of the risks that are posed in the next 10 years. If you look at these, and I'll only address the first 10, both the short term as well as the medium term, you need to ask yourself, as an institution, and more particularly as an individual, is this the focus of our research? Firstly, and secondly, is this the focus of perhaps the institution? And thirdly, to what extent are we developing policies around addressing these risks? In the next 2 years, and we'll discuss it further, is misinformation and disinformation. The second is seen as extreme weather events. The third is seen as societal polarization, which I'll come back to. The fourth is seen as cyber insecurity and cyber crime, which has been linked to violent crime. And the fifth is interstate armed conflict. Now, looking more sort of medium term, as I say, to the next 10 years, we can see that for the United Nations anyway, the top 3 issues that require research and more unpacking in terms of policy are the environmental related, meaning extreme weather events, critical change in the Earth systems, the collapse of much of the ecosystem. So you can see, looking at these points, to a large extent, there are different predictions as to the consequences. And India, to a large extent, is evolving in the debate regarding climate. Now, fourth would be natural resources shortage, and fifth, unlike currently, is misinformation and Looking at that list, one needs to ask yourself, is that what I'm lecturing about? Is that what I'm researching about? Because if you want to be published, particularly in the from next year, you're going to find that these are the issues that public journals and even conferences to a large extent, and I'm talking across the board, whether you're in computer science, nursing, management, are going to be the issues that are on the table. Just as we saw 20, 30 years ago with AIDS being a hot topic in terms of getting published. Not only is getting published important, but there's two other considerations. One, whether you're going to find that grants are available to do the research that you're planning to do. And secondly, whether you're able to identify international partners to do the research with, because of the increasing emphasis on collaborative research rather than regional or national type of research. And that brings you back to your emphasis on internationalization. The second major global issue, the first one was looking at the actual risk factors. The second one is that this year is the biggest election year in history, with more than 64 countries going to the ballot box, with representing 4.2 billion people, which represents 49% of the world's population. Now, one needs to keep track of what is actually happening in these elections. Because if we look at them, if there are significant shifts, this will emphasize how we actually conduct research and what we conduct research into, as well as whether we will actually have our research published. Now, in addition to the large number of national elections, we also have the European Union election and this is occurring amid a resurgence of right-wing parties on the continent. Let me turn now to some more specific considerations. The first is, if we look at what we're doing, the whole concept of what is truth has, since the emergence of COVID, come under tremendous skepticism. So we expected as academics to operate within a milieu of verified facts that are being collected and transmitted, but is this actually happening? So we constantly having to ask ourselves, is what we're actually reading, is what we're actually discussing the truth? And what is the trustworthiness of research findings? Now, a brief scanning of the environments shows that there's a diminishing trust in the whole trust of scientific data and scientists in particular. We can see that trust has fallen in European countries as well as in American countries. One of the reasons for this is that COVID brought science, and I use that in inverted commas, into everyone's living room. It resulted in popular debate. And what are the consequences of that? One of the consequences is that the growing mistrust in scientists, and this is really as a consequence of much of the data in how we should actually handle COVID, has occurred. It's not the exclusive factor, but it's one of the more important factors. So why we can see that this decline in trust is also exacerbated by social and popular media, where we often find that journalist type of articles and public addresses and books have been stimulated by the whole growth of a number of factors. And let's look at that. Why do we have this tremendous amount of mistrust in science and scientists. The first thing is that we've seen the absolute growth in the number of conspiracy theories that are seeking to actually promote a particular ideology or a group of people. The second we look is the whole aspect of clickbait, that trust has been undermined because many people now put up very emotional headings and content in order to pressurize and attract a readership and a learnership, a listenership, should I say. So if you now look at viewers that go to a particular site, for example, in YouTube, and I'm sure you've seen that yourself, we look at students and even academics using a particular video to show in class, are very influenced by the actual heading of the video. So in terms of this, what we have actually seen is hyper-partisan content of information. So we see the partisan development of social networks, which have really become echo chambers that are amplifying a certain message. In addition to these factors, we've seen the growth of pseudoscience, and many people would have said that occurred in COVID period as well, of fabrication of false news, an increase in spam, and an increase of the use of low credibility sources. Alternative, if we actually look in India, we see that there is still research that was done in 2022, that there is still a very high appreciation of science. Now, whether you will be able to hold on to that is going to be interesting. So the trust levels are higher than globally, but there's still a level of skepticism about science and research findings. Now, why is this important? I think if you look at the 2024-2023 World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, was held under the banner of rebuilding trust, of actually being able to now trust what we read, trust what we actually have published. How's this affecting you? First of all, with these factors of increasing spam and low credibility, etc., there's a polarization of the world. And on the one side, you see those that are advocating a more globalist perspective of advocating the interpretation of economic and foreign policy in terms of developments worldwide. Alternatively, we see more nationalist development, people that are speaking about making America, Argentina, etc., great again. And it's quite interesting if you look at the current farmers' protests in Europe. This is a larger reflection of this polarization of the world in terms of globalists and nationalists. I'm simplifying it. Sorry, I'm not being able to go to great lengths. Now, India has not been immune to this polarization, as expressed in your national politics. Nevertheless, you have to date been quite successful in navigating this dichotomy. However, that navigation is not without territorial and political tension. Why are facts being questioned? As I've already sort of looked at in terms of the above discussion, previous discussion. One thing is that when we are coming into a class or when we are actually doing research, there's often a manifestation of unintentional bias, meaning that we are unconsciously structuring our presentations and our research around falsehoods. Now, a second point is there's been an absolute growth of misinformation, meaning fake, misleading information that is taken out of the context, and an increase in disinformation, namely, again, misleading content, but with an intent to actually deceive or cause harm. Now, when we look at misinformation and disinformation, we can see it's often motivated by three factors. One, to gain political power or influence. Two, to actually gain profit. And three, to actually sow chaos and confusion, particularly among policymakers and just generally average civil society, not being able to actually know whether what they are hearing in terms of academics or whether they should believe in what is being told on the internet, etc. Now, this polarization of truth is well expressed in the saying that the main weapon of war is not bullets, but truth. So if we actually look and try to understand, for example, at present, the current clash in Gaza, it is difficult to know what is the difference between fact and propaganda. We can therefore say that the first thing to die in a war is truth. And as I pointed out in my opening remarks, society is being characterized, globally being characterized by increasing number of conflicts. Now, why is this misinformation, disinformation a problem? We can see that, first of all, facts and discussion are being amplified across a wider range of platforms and reaching a wider audience, which has it in the potential of actually causing a tremendous amount of civil unrest, civil conflict. And we can see that the Indian government has attempted to address that in its stopping of TikTok, its raiding of Twitter offices, or currently called X, because one of the major sources of disinformation in India is Facebook. So we find that people are actually developing their opinions, not based on science, but because of what they read and listen to on social media. It is also a problem because it's exceptionally difficult to monitor and requires really sophisticated tools and technologies. Now, if we look at South Africa, this is really problematic because we're having to play catch up in terms of developing policies of what is or what constitutes misinformation and disinformation. One way of dealing with it, although in itself is problematic, is constant fact-checking of social media. But there's a number of consequences for the actual freedom of the individual to actually hear and have access to information. So we see that with all this misinformation and disinformation, academics are almost like having to play hopscotch on a minefield in deciding what is actually fact and what is not. But we are partly also to blame for that. Then let's look at why we're to blame and how globally academics are almost to blame for much of the decline of truth. First of all, we see the creation and spread of what is termed manufactured knowledge. Now, if we actually think in our class, how often do we actually repeat something over and over until it becomes real, until the students repeat it? However, to what extent, when we make these statements and when we actually quote, do we actually go back to look at the original source and ask ourselves how was that theoretically or methodologically substantiated? The next point that I want to turn to is the whole aspect of digital colonization. And we can see how many of us are perpetuating that colonization. If we take, how often do we actually use mass media? I just think of things like Telegram and WhatsApp, without actually asking ourselves, where's all that data being harvested or actually stored? Now, we can see when we actually look at that India has really taken the position of wanting to look at to what extent it can localize data in the same way that Russia and China. However, even with the localization of data, there's a number of problems, meaning that will it allow, as we've seen, governments to actually access data and use it against individuals. And I think one of the classic points was last year in the case of Canadian truckers protests. Another way in which we incline to perpetuate that is actually the use of the internet in academia. And we can see that through the use of the internet, we're actually stimulating the actual bias that is almost internal to much of the internet. And when we look at this in more close detail, we see that there's algorithm bias. And how we actually decide, for example, what to actually search for is influenced not only by the search word that we actually enter, but also the broader, let's call it ideology, behind the actual algorithms. And I'll come back to that just now. Another point that that academics are guilty of is stimulating the rise of academic influences. Now, the whole aspect of influencing has grown tremendously. If we look just back in 2021, it was a 13 billion industry as opposed to 20. It was 9. So it's really increasing tremendously. Now, traditionally, influencers have been associated with business and more branding, company marketing. But increasingly, we're seeing them now influencing academia. Now, although they have very unique knowledge and insight, we always have to realize that when we're actually dealing with individuals on the internet, we often also are dealing with individuals that have a particular position that they want to promote. Therefore, when we look at how academia is being shaped by academic influences, we can see that they are transforming the whole way knowledge is disseminated. Yes, they are making the whole era of learning more dynamic, with their visionary insights. And to a large extent, they are shaping. How are they shaping you? Well, they're influencing, for example, how institutions, educational institutions are being ranked by evaluating the institution, their qualifications, their faculty members, the campus culture, the student experience, etc. They are also potentially diverting, should I say, students to particular institutions. By saying that they are helping people make more informed decisions about education. And I think it's very important for you to actually go and look at these academic influences and see what is the perspective of your institution and to what extent are they shaping the students' willingness to actually want to be educated. They're also, to a large extent, influencing the networks within the academic community by connecting researchers and acting as bridges between disciplines. Now, these can have tremendous positive effects. However, if they are only promoting one ideological group of academics, this can be really problematic. Finally, my next point is when we look at scientific mistrust, it's to a large extent, and this is very relevant to many developing countries, particularly like India and China, is the whole concept of academic thought. Now, there's very little research on this, and nevertheless, the research that you do actually see is that it's an increasing threat to academia and the image of academia. Although it's not something new, it's been around for hundreds of years, it nevertheless begins to foster some of my opening remarks, meaning the questioning by civil society of academics. Now, this takes various forms. If you actually look at it globally, that academics are forging, for example, or falsifying the actual research findings, taking payments to manipulate results, plagiarism. And a very good example of that is the Harvard president's recent expose, where academics were attempting to redefine what constitutes plagiarism. Further point, we can see fake reviewers and the purchasing of pre-written papers and reviews, ethical breaches, citation manipulation. Let me just turn back to the whole concept of ethics. One of the points that I'm concerned about, and I don't know whether it is still a common practice, but certainly for the past 15 years that I was visiting India, is that there was very little consideration of ethics in research, or even ethics within the classroom. I didn't come, although I questioned, I in no way say it was extensive, I didn't come across any institution that had an ethics committee that looked at research proposals to determine whether they are ethical or not. Specifically regarding the use and sampling of vulnerable populations, such as poor people, elderly people, children, etc. From an external fraudulent position, we can see that there's a number of predatory practices by journals, increase in dubious journals, the high journal publication costs, and trying to actually elicit payments out of people to put you first in the queue for publication. So we also see the rise of pseudo publications, publications that are willing to promise a quick publication for people. And there are a number of open access journals that have jumped from 18,000 in 2010 to 8,000 in 2014, tremendous and further jump. But what is concerning is that many of these journals are based in India, in some cases Nigeria, and to a lesser extent in the US. So when we actually look, why is academic fraud actually increasing? We can see that, and if you look globally, there's a scarcity of research funding. Many academic paths, careers are structured around publications. And the way academics are rewarded is often through having your work published. Also, the fraud has been exacerbated by the fact that academics are seen as having autonomy, which again I have not seen in the Indian context. Institutions having a very structured research policy that underpins the whole thing of a research committee that would actually really interrogate any research proposal that's submitted either by an academic or a student who wishes to do a higher degree. The problem of fraud is also exacerbated by modern mass academia. So it's exceptionally difficult to actually identify and track individual researchers that are committing fraud. Also, we don't really get rewarded for researching articles and books to assess whether they're fraudulent. Few are willing to actually do that. You can therefore see that fraud has become a major external constraint, both globally and as well as nationally, particularly when we're attempting to retain academic credibility. What does that mean for us? Well, we're going to have to start looking at some of the points I've raised about ethics committees, research committees, but more importantly, we actually need to be reading books and articles with a much more critical eye. This may be laborious, and often one feels that, as I pointed out above, because you read something over and over and it becomes manufactured knowledge, you begin to assume that this is actually true without actually sort of interrogating. The next major point that I want to move on to is to what extent is academia being influenced by a dominant ideology or frame of reference or worldview? And to what extent, when we look at that, is that influencing whether we actually being published or not? Now, again, we find that when we ask ourselves what is the dominant ideology within globally, namely what is the current hegemonic paradigm in academia, either in India or globally, few of us would actually be able to give a coherent answer to that. And I'll sort of point out some of the implications of that. The second thing, when we look at dominant ideology, to what extent is corporate and academic management defining what we think and how we express such things? Are we seeing, therefore, that academic freedom has become almost an illusion? Now, returning to dominant ideology, I'm not sure how many academics actually look at who published a particular publication, be it book or article or journal, and looked at what is the particular ideological perspective that this journal or publisher is attempting to actually promulgate. When I talk about ideology, I'm referring to, you can see it as perspective or theoretical or philosophical underpinnings or paradigm or methodological orientation. We can actually sort of discuss that. So what I'm actually saying is that globally, few of us attempt to understand what lies behind or underneath what is actually being in terms of paradigm. Now, any answer to that obviously is multi-layered and cannot be really completely addressed in a presentation.
There are fruits which are seasonal. Mango grows only in this season, the summer. Right?
Sorry?
It can be grown in the greenhouse, that is a different thing. Anything can be grown in the greenhouse and at any time with controlled temperature. But normally, there is a season.
I can't hear.
The trees,
I can't hear.
like that, some of the festivals.
Sorry, you're breaking up. For example, whether our reading comes from a constructionist, structuralist, or positivist, or Marxian or postmodern perspective, all of these have a way of actually determining whether you would be published or not. You can see that when we actually look at this, we find that you as an individual have a particular worldview which you promulgate through your ideology. And I'm talking about a theoretical ideology. And when you actually lecture, you again perpetuate this. And it's important for you to actually understand that, because for three reasons. One, when you actually have written an article, the first thing you should actually do is ask yourself, what is the theoretical underpinnings of the journal that I wish to have my article published? That is usually quite easy to determine, because you can look at past articles that were, what frame of reference were they actually written. Secondly, one then looks at, if I was to publish in this article, who is the likely editor to be? Again, it's likely to be a name, and one could actually research that and see whether the person that is the editor of that journal holds a particular ideological perspective, which may either agree or disagree with what you have written. The third one is a little bit more difficult. And that is that in every case of an accredited or reviewed publication, it is sent to reviewers, over which you have little control. Meaning that whoever reads your article may hold a different perspective to you, and therefore may interpret the results differently, may interpret even why you researched it as different. Now, this is a significant difference when you actually examine a treatise where the external examiner is expected not to actually allow their own theoretical or methodological viewpoint to undermine your particular research. Now, I think just to give you a very important example of the current dominant ideology in society and how you need to frame your research or lectures to be accepted or published. It's a case of when you actually do an artificial intelligence search. I decided to look at this and took the example of asking Copilot to answer the following question. What is the extent of academic fraud in India? Now, I'm not going to read the full response, but what was interesting, the AI actually discussed what academic fraud was in India and the various forms that academic fraud can take in India. And then at the end of this discussion of giving it said, and the wrongful detention of scholars and students. The next paragraph then gave a whole discussion that contradicted the policies of the ruling party. So can we see that just by entering something into AI, we are getting a particular perspective which a student is likely to get of what constitutes a particular subject. However, when I actually asked it to whether wrongful detention of a scholar was fraud, it responded no. So we can clearly see from this example that how AI is to a large extent manipulating us, and more importantly, manipulating students by pushing a particular frame of reference or ideological position. Now, looking at just the link between academia and business, and the whole ideology of business and management, we can see that to a large extent it is written from a structuralist or managerialist position. However, what is becoming more and more important now is to actually look at who controls the corporation of business. Who are the actual people that invest their money in a business? Namely, who actually has power in the business? Now, any answer to this question is again nuanced. But what is important is it has raised a debate about asset management institutions such as BlackRock and Vanguard and others, about how they are influencing business ideology and policy. We can see that when we look at the mission statements of, for example, Vanguard and BlackRock, who have sizable investments in India, that the whole mission often of the investment is linked to the promotion of diversity and inclusion in business activities and partnerships. Now, I think this is something which is very important and needs to actually be monitored, both on a local and a regional and a national.
Professor Peter, can we take some questions? It's already 8 o'clock here. Can we take a couple of questions?
Can I just, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Can I just make one final remark?
Yeah, please.
The next point, which is important to actually ask yourself, what is globally the cultural war that has actually occurred, namely between that data is being interpreted from either conservative or progressive position. And why I raise this point is to a large extent, we find that academics are self-centering themselves to avoid actually being cancelled. And we see sort of wide evidence of that. Let me take some questions.
The people can unmute themselves and ask a question. Dr. Manjula?
I have nothing much to ask, It has been a very insightful lecture. And that's what a lot of issues have come. About the internationalization, one thing which came to my mind is that, how do we benchmark the quality at a global level? Is there any criterions? That's what one thing it was us trying to understand.
Thanks for the question. I was actually going to raise it. What we've seen in the whole quality debate, whereas originally we looked at are we exceptional, and we established benchmarks. Then we looked at is there actually good value for what we're actually educating. Currently, the emphasis is on quality as transformative, meaning to what extent are we actually creating a student that is able to very rapidly transform themselves in a very rapid transforming world. So quality has now become defined by its transformative value, be it in terms of is the person able to adapt quickly, is the person able to change their forms of communication, etc. So yes, that's a very, very important point. And one needs to ask yourself when you're actually lecturing, to what extent are you looking at this, can I say in inverted commas, new definition of what constitutes quality in education? Does that answer your question?
I have one issue. See, in addition to the quality which Dr. Manjula mentioned, the recruitment and the stability of the faculty in any teaching institute is very important. Now, the recruitment of the people in universities and higher education institutions is not very proper at this stage, because of lot of interference from many quarters. Number one. And number two, the people are recruited for one particular academic session, not for the and this whole duration. And therefore, the faculty which is appointed, which is recruited, is not able to deliver the quality, in my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, there's two issues. One, that of research and lecturing resource allocation and budgeting. I think we can accept that, particularly in these current times of, except in the case of India. But globally, there's restrictions on the availability of budgets. But let me turn to your second point of younger academics being appointed, what you may see as less qualified academics being appointed. Again, it relates to my concept that I was putting forward of this dominant ideology that now exists within society. And that dominant ideology is underpinned by three things, but two major points: that of inclusivity and diversity. So we are finding that when we actually look at people now, we need to ask ourselves not what is their academic stature or what is their academic qualification, etc., but to what extent do they bring a new voice to the institution? To what extent do they bring a new frame of reference to the institution? And we can see that this becomes very important when we start looking at intergenerational conflict between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. So globally, and particularly in South Africa, we've seen an emergence of the last 15 years of what many are defining as underqualified academics. But when you look on the other side, what these academics are bringing in is a whole new way of looking at the academic institution.
I think we'll take one more question if anybody has. Otherwise, we'll say thank you. Anybody else has got any question? Anybody? If there's nothing, then thank you very much, Professor Peter, for being with us today and showing your glimpse of unlimited wisdom on the cultural issues and the world of dominant ideology versus non-dominant ideology, etc., etc. I think that was a fascinating, abstract, though abstract, discussion, which will help us as an academician. Thank you very much, Professor Peter, for being with us. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us.
Looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Oh, well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.